Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Peter Klein, and I want to welcome you to our session. Got some feedback. Welcome to this session on entrepreneurship and innovation in the 21st century. Now, we've heard a lot at the conference so far about the role of innovation in economic growth and the potential role of public policy in facilitating innovations of different kind. But we haven't heard as much about the micro foundations of the innovation process, in particular the role of the entrepreneur. Now, Adam Smith was certainly familiar with large enterprise, or at least the idea of large enterprise. As we learned yesterday, he may or may not have visited a pin factory, which brought to my mind the quip from the English economist Ely Devens, which was famously recounted by Ronald Coase. Quote, "If economists wished to study the horse, they wouldn't go and look at horses. They'd sit in their studies and say to themselves, what would I do if I were a horse?" Now, Smith was a keen observer of events around him. I believe it was Gordon Brown who hypothesized yesterday that some of Smith's views on trade may have been inspired by his observations of the comings and goings of ships in Crocodie Harbor. Well, Smith certainly did appreciate the role of smaller ventures. It was Smith, after all, who famously described Britain as a nation of shopkeepers. So what role does entrepreneurship play in our system today? Well, we know that employment growth is disproportionately generated by small firms and new firms. But what about breakthrough innovations? After all, the garage and dorm room startups of a few decades ago are now the Apples and Googles and Facebooks and Dells. Are they still innovating to the same extent, or are they using their dominant market positions to thwart innovations from newer firms? What is the role of government in promoting entrepreneurship and innovation? We've heard already about support of education and basic science and so forth, but does government have a role through more specific industrial policies or by promoting particular types of firms or even particular firms? What about regulation and antitrust? Should these tools be applied more aggressively to big companies and platforms as the so-called hipster antitrust movement would advocate? What about social issues? How do we protect individual privacy in an era not only of the surveillance state, and I'm thinking not just of China, but of the United Kingdom, but also large tech platforms that track our movements across the internet? Do social media firms have the right or even the obligation to monitor and police particular kinds of content or activity on their platforms? To what extent is entrepreneurship embedded in culture and even language? As President George W. Bush was incorrectly, though understandably, alleged to have said while speaking at an event in France, you can see why France is not very entrepreneurial. They don't even have their own word for entrepreneur. And finally, how do we understand the behavior and thinking of entrepreneurs and other creative agents in society? How do they theorize about their environment? How do they learn from their mistakes? Are they best understood as discoverers or as creators? What's the role of uncertainty in the entrepreneurial process? What role should entrepreneurship play in economic theory and other models of social systems? Well, joining me today to discuss these and other issues are my distinguished colleagues and friends, Benito Arruñada, Jay Barney, Gary Pisano, and Todd Zenger. So as you can see, we have these issues covered from A to Z. And I'm going to ask each panelist to offer some brief prepared remarks, I guess in alphabetical order, followed by some moderated panel discussion, and then of course we'll open it up to questions and answers from the audience. So Benito, I'll ask you to start. Okay. If it's okay, I think maybe we'll all just stay. You prefer here, up here? Okay.
Good morning. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks for coming. Well, I will be talking about blockchain, but don't worry. I will be talking about what the blockchain bubble tells us about the main themes of the conference, and especially why the blockchain experience somehow, I think, refutes two of the most common claims repeated during the conference. After having studied blockchain for 3 years, I think unintentionally, it was not my purpose. I had to study blockchain, sorry, must excuse this because it was not my intention, but blockchain has suffered or show us misallocation of resources, show us also the segmentation of knowledge and the bad consequences that it brings. And thirdly, how the moral blindness of libertarian beliefs is damaging our economies and the innovation process. First, misallocation of resources. I mean, how much capital has been wasted financing ventures with lack of credible business models in blockchain? How much, even this is even more serious, how much incumbent monopolies, mainly the biggest banks, have dilapidated fortunes, just trying to keep under their control the infrastructure of financial markets, that is payment, settlement, and clearing systems. These facts lead me to question one of the claims in the conference. It has been told that corporate capitalism suffers short-termism. Well, maybe it's true in some areas, but what we see in the blockchain area is to some extent the opposite. We see a sort of casino investment with borrowed money. In a sense, people are betting on too much on the very, very long term with borrowed money. This type of investments are optimal only for decision makers when they are not investing their own money. And the problem has been aggravated, as you know, by a macroeconomic policy that distorts the most fundamental pricing in any modern economy, the cost of capital. The blockchain bubble built up, and this is my second point on herding behavior, but herding behavior, the fact that decision makers have been following each other in a quite rational manner, is related to group thinking. And group thinking is exacerbated by the fragmentation of knowledge. The second point that the blockchain illustrates. Note that blockchain promises to enable P2P, person-to-person transactions based on contracts with automatic enforcement, the so-called code is law panacea, and therefore no need for trusted intermediaries. However, in practice, these promises have fell behind. The libertarian engineers who made them were isolated in disciplinary silos, even worse, in ideological silos, and forgot basic institutional and behavioral difficulties. They promise code is law, a panacea that presumes the ability to write complete contracts contemplating all relevant contingencies. They promise also to be able to trade everything, confusing mere personal claims with property rights. When doing so, they were forgetting the basic lessons well known in institutional economics and in law, that both problems are not solved individually by private ordering. They are solved by public institutions, by some forms of public ordering. Thirdly, and in a sense related, I mentioned libertarian blindness. I mean, according to the no-intermediaries dream of blockchain enthusiasts, individuals would be trading valuable assets such as homes through person-to-person systems without relying on lawyers and public registries, but merely relying on smart contracts, relying on computer code. Well, you might remember the last time you lost your password for any internet service. It's a daily incident. We are accustomed to lose them, and we rely on intermediaries to recover these passwords. This would be impossible with a P2P system. We individuals, we simply would have lost our homes in that case. It is quite obvious that this cannot be a solution for human beings. It might be a solution for Homo economicus, the abstraction that some economists use, but not for real human beings. In essence, these libertarian engineers were forgetting that freedom is too expensive in terms of responsibility for most individuals. There is a common thread, a common cause in these three failures. It is the specialization which is the main element in the wealth of nations, I would say. Specialization is costly but also unstable. Specialization brings necessarily agency cost, and it opens the opportunity for all sorts of misbehaviors, not only by agents but also by providers of indulgences. In essence, the critique in the theory of moral sentiments about Catholic casuistry, the critique about priests, is a critique about specialists, because Catholic priests were specialists in the production of the moral code. And Smith suffers a contradiction in his two books in this respect. In The Wealth of Nations, promotes productive specialization. In the theory of moral sentiments, criticizes moral specialization in terms of relying on priests and relying on the church for morality. Well, this is an example of the problems that specialization poses. Corporate governance is another one, but also silos, knowledge silos, is a problem of specialization. We scientists are very happy in our silos. This allows us to control ourselves. And if the silo is ideologically homogeneous, as it is increasingly happening, less so in economics, but in other disciplines the situation is terrible. The political homogeneity of some fields is 99%. This means that, of course, we get the high moral ground, and we are happier in this type of silos. Well, let's move to prescriptions, if I can, or to hints, what this might tell us to be more positive. Focusing on the three issues. On governance reform, well, to some extent it's inevitable to have agency costs and to have problems. Okay. I would encourage you to be more aware that the existence of this agency cost in corporate governance has led to the appearance of sellers of indulgences, a mostly unproductive industry, and the very extent of the agency problem tends to be exaggerated by the sellers of indulgences. Think about it. Next time you find a corporate report on corporate governance, a report on corporate governance, I mean, this is very similar to the pre-Reformation sale of indulgences by the church. They define the moral code, and then for a fee, they tell you that you are behaving well. A bit cynical, but there is something like that going on. Here lies a source of instability for this type of specialization, because there are many people in society interested in promoting themselves in this industry. More worrying and more difficult, and the blockchain case illustrates well this point, is the presence of herding behavior. Now, in fact, decisions are distorted by the fact that people decision makers don't think but merely follow. I increasingly worry in this aspect by the interaction between, of course, the silos, the scientific silos, but also the interaction between the media and the intellectuals and the scientists. In some fields, I have found, for instance, in administrative simplification, I mean, doing business related, that the interaction between the producers of knowledge and the media has been very damaging for societies. Because the media has been promoted a very naive view, a sport-like view of administrative simplification that has led to, in my opinion, to very bad results. This interaction should be revised. Second point, about silos. We should reverse, I think. Having making interdisciplinary work for all my life is not rewarding. The problem is that it doesn't reward. If you do interdisciplinary work, between law and economics, for instance, economists think that you do law and you are bad economists, and lawyers think that you are infringing and you don't know enough law, you don't know the concept, the precise concept, and things like that. Well, I don't think interdisciplinary interaction is enough. I mean, putting different people together is enough. I think we should go deeper into thinking, I mean, reforming education and reforming research to do it in an interdisciplinary manner. Third, the issue about the media. We should rethink the media is distorting science, the way it publicizes science. Thirdly, what about libertarian illusions? Well, we should stop worshipping liberty. Liberty is not the only pillar of morality, as many libertarians think. In this regard, I think we should reconsider, I encourage you to reconsider the Calvinist emphasis on mutual control, which is central in the theory of moral sentiments. And this is my final remark, and also my second counterclaim against the main issues in the conference. I submit that the idea of the impartial spectator is now maladapted. This was central for Smith, and probably it had sufficient time. It was maladapted at some time when we were much poorer. It allows impersonal exchange. However, there are signs that, at least in our societies, is not working very well. The prevalence of violence, alcoholism, suicide in Scandinavian countries, which are the paradigm of the impartial spectator, should tell us something. I suspect also that the rejection by youngsters, I mean by millennials, and also the generation, the rejection of Calvinist worth ethics might be related. I suspect that pre-Reformation capitalism, which was created not in Scandinavia but in places like Florence, has something to tell us. Being in Edinburgh, I wouldn't say that capitalism has to have a Florentine touch, but maybe. Now it's time to finish. Thank you very much.
Okay. No one's following my instructions, but.
So much for central planning. Although I do think if we had enough computing power, we could come up with a set of equations we could solve. I'm uneasily skeptical about that particular assertion. Thank you for the opportunity to come and talk to you a little bit today. I think one thing that's become clear in the conversation the last couple days is that while Adam Smith had a lot to say about the causes and consequences of economic growth, that there is one area where there is an omitted variable, and that would be the area of innovation and entrepreneurship. In my original notes that I sent to Peter, I said I'd like to title my talk, "Why Pins?" And the reason that's interesting, I think that's an interesting question, is that by studying pin manufacturing, Adam Smith was able to abstract away from one of the critical problems in the 21st century, which was, what is the demand for these new products and services? So pins were a well-established technology. It was really a matter of trying to find the most efficient form of production. And certainly that continues to be an issue, so we have much to learn from Smith, but individual labor, et cetera. But the problem in innovation entrepreneurship is making substantial investments where the demand for the products and services that are generated by those investments is uncertain ex ante. Ex post, we can all agree, yeah, this has a huge impact on economic growth, but ex ante, it's a little more challenging to figure out what to do with that. In fact, economists in general have not been particularly good at dealing with the problems of innovation and entrepreneurship. Most of the economic models I read take the form of set up the model, assume entrepreneurship, and then let's see what happens. So the sort of how entrepreneurship actually occurs, how innovation actually occurs, is not a centerpiece of most economic analyses. There are exceptions, and usually when those exceptions are, Schumpeter, for example, has a long discussion of the source of innovation in the economy, and he basically gets it wrong. The assertion that we have large monopolists who then use that extra cash they generate to innovate, that actually empirically does not seem to be the way innovation actually occurs in the economy, something that you were referring to earlier. Of course, there is some work on the institutional preconditions of innovation, property rights, and things like that. So I'm not going to be dismissive of the entire field, but economists have a problem dealing with innovation entrepreneurship that I'll talk about in just a minute. So it might make sense in this context, I know this is a radical idea especially for many of my economics friends, to actually look to the entrepreneurship literature and see what they're talking about when they're talking about where innovation and entrepreneurship comes from. In that context, Peter and I have been engaging recently in an ongoing debate that we don't have to talk about today. We'll just sort of set it aside temporarily, Peter. Just relax. In any case, you relax.
You cut your mic off at
any time. Economists believe in markets until they're in charge, and then they cut your mic off whenever they can. So the idea here, of course, is what motivates innovation in entrepreneurship generally is the idea that individuals can generate wealth from doing so. And wealth here isn't just money, although it's clearly money as well, but it's also a sense of independence and freedom and accomplishment. And they do that by forming and exploiting opportunities, and opportunities can be defined as competitive imperfections in product and factor markets that make the possibility of economic profits possible. And there are basically two ways that can happen that have been described in entrepreneurship literature. That is, opportunities can be created by exogenous shocks to establish markets or industries, or opportunities can be created by the actions of entrepreneurs themselves. That is, opportunities can be endogenous to entrepreneurial action. Those two are quite different. Let me talk a little about the discovery. It was called the discovery view. It's the exogenous shocks to establish industries. These could be changes in regulation, changes in technology, demographics, consumer preferences. These things are all out of the control of the entrepreneur. And what happens is they create disequilibria in markets, and those disequilibria create the opportunity for smart, and not just smart, you have to be, the actual language is alert individuals who spot those opportunities and then move quickly to exploit them. There's some interesting features of that model of entrepreneurship. For example, since these opportunities are in principle observable, that means that we have to explain first why not everyone takes advantage of those opportunities, and that's where alertness comes in. And entrepreneurship scholars who follow this model have been trying to identify the sources of alertness for many decades and have failed to do so at this point. There may be some reasons to believe that cognitive processes may be important, but we can talk about that if we have time. Also, because these opportunities are in principle observable, then it's possible, it should be possible for entrepreneurs to collect data about them, estimate the probability distributions associated with them. So in other words, in this world, entrepreneurs are operating under conditions of risk and can apply all the standard present value techniques associated with this. Now, most of the discussion that we've had so far on entrepreneurship and innovation in the conference seems to have adopted implicitly, maybe certainly not explicitly, the notion, this discovery notion that somehow opportunities are these results of these exogenous shocks to industries and markets. This notion of windows of opportunities, I haven't read the book, obviously, but the notion of windows of opportunity sounds like a sort of the streams of history combined in particular ways that create opportunities for innovation and possible rent generation. There's been also some conversations about latent demand, trying to, what entrepreneurs try to do is to try to understand what the latent demand is. The notion is that the demand is already out there, we just have to discover what it is. And well, the creation view is that entrepreneurs, in fact, opportunities are created endogenously by entrepreneurial action. And this is a world where individuals have, to call them theories, as my colleague does, which we'll shortly assert, is probably a little strong, more like vague hypotheses about possible ways that market competitive imperfections might be created. They're operating under conditions of Knightian uncertainty, the deep uncertainty that was talked about earlier in the conference. And they engage in small experiments where they fail, they try to learn, but learning is deeply ambiguous. All you really learn, I tried to sell this blue widget and all I know is people didn't want to buy it. Is it because it's blue? Is it because it's a widget? Is it too small? I don't know. So learning is a deeply problematic process in that context because of uncertainty. This learning process as it continues, if it continues, because it often doesn't, is path dependent in the sense that you begin accumulating down a particular path of learning. It's also evolutionary, and it's strictly evolutionary in terms of non-teleological logic. It's not, and sometimes, not always, and it's difficult to predict how often this will happen, but sometimes the result of this process will be the creation of an opportunity that could not have been thought of through the standard business planning discovery model. I can give you lots of examples of these. My favorite one is the Ice Hotel. If we had more time, I could go through the entire history of the Ice Hotel. I presume people have heard of this. I will just assert the following. There was no strategic planning process in Hyatt or Hilton or Marriott that would have come to the conclusion that the right thing to do is to invest in a hotel made of ice. I guarantee that would not have happened. Okay? In fact, it was very much a creation process, and away we go. So these distinctions between discovery and creation are not just theoretically interesting, they actually have really important implications, both practical and theoretical and policy. So example, from a point of view of business development, discovery is all about make a plan, work the plan, business planning is really critical. Creation, it's about cheap experiments, learning on the fly, adjusting quickly. It's a really different mindsets. In business schools, we teach all about business planning, which turns out to be probably not relevant for a lot of real entrepreneurial experiences. In financing, in finance, the discovery model, you go to banks and VCs. See, the problem here is information asymmetry. The entrepreneur sees the opportunity. The banks don't see it yet. All you have to do is reduce the information asymmetry. You get access to capital. It's a standard, actually, standard efficient capital market story. In creation, the problem is not information asymmetry. The problem is there's no information. And so you can't use banks, you can't use VCs. So how do you do it? It's sweat equity, bootstrapping, that's code for sweat equity. It's friends, families, and fools as sources of capital. And maybe business angels, because in that context you're betting on the person, not the idea, because the idea itself will change dramatically, likely. Decision making in discovery, you can use standard discounted present value, discounted cash flows analysis works perfectly well. And in creation, How do you make decisions under 19 uncertainty? Well, you actually apply biases and heuristics that have been well studied in cognitive psychology and actually have a great deal of value. A couple last points. What's the source of competitive advantage in discovery? Well, patents, very important. Intellectual property rights, very important. And in creation, the process of creating the opportunity is path-dependent and socially complex. And so the process of creating the opportunity is the source of sustained competitive advantage. Completely different model. It also has some important policy discussions. My concern here is that even in the midst of emphasizing the omitted variable of creation, of creating entrepreneurial activities and innovation, that by adopting a discovery-only perspective, we can maybe lose we can interfere with some activities that could actually encourage more creative kinds of entrepreneurship. For example, in the big debate that we had a year or so ago in the United States about crowdfunding new investments, the SEC got involved, and their logic was, well, crowdfunding, that's just another kind of investment. Therefore, we should regulate that like we would regulate any investment. This is in a country where it's legal to put a credit card into a slot machine, but we're not going to let you invest $100 in a startup. Because that policy failed to distinguish between discovery kinds of startups and creation kinds of startups, where they might be interesting. And then finally, much of the research, much of the teaching still in our business schools is still based solely on a business planning model and a discovery model, and not on this possibility of endogenous creation of opportunities. Thank you.
You want to follow the herd? Or?
No, I will stay seated, thanks. I'm just lazy. I guess, so thank you very much. So I'm going to talk about what I'll call this the innovation playbook for the 21st century. And I think it's worth keeping in mind, first of all, we've been innovating as humans for a long time, for tens of thousands of years, and we're pretty good at it. But what's interesting, we constantly change the way we innovate. So we innovate the way we innovate. I think that's an important part of our history of innovation and our understanding. And I'd like to engage you in some thinking about what the next way we're going to innovate will be in the 21st century. So let me start, and what can we learn from Smith and some others about that? What are some of the principles? And I think you think about different starring roles that different kinds of actors played in different conceptions of innovation and our models of innovation. So for Smith, obviously, it's the market. I mean, he introduces us to the market. Smith didn't talk about the role of the market in driving innovation, but it's obvious that markets do drive innovation, partly through incentive effects, but most importantly because markets are a wonderful institution for massively parallel experimentation. So if you believe in any kind of evolutionary approach to innovation, you've got to have some mechanism for massively parallel experimentation. And that's what markets do for us, and that's the kind of foundation from Smith. Now, a couple of centuries later, Schumpeter adds to this this dialogue in some way and introduces another actor to play another starring role. He builds on obviously the invisible hand of the market. Schumpeter believed in the market, but he adds this other actor, the entrepreneur. So we'll call that, I'll use the term, the visible hand of the entrepreneur. He didn't use that term. It's a Chandlerian term. We'll come to that later. But it's really, if you think about the invisible hand of the market plus the visible hand of the entrepreneur, you get creative destruction. And that then leads us to the kind of third kind of player in this who kind of helped us conceptualize the enterprise, because neither one of them were really talking about the role of the enterprise in some way, which is Chandler. And there, Chandler, he introduces the concept, the visible hand of the manager. It's actually the professional manager and the role of the organization. Now, Chandler talked about organizations building capabilities and their dynamism of their growth. So while he wasn't specifically talking about innovation, I think it's implied. So we kind of have Smith about the markets, Schumpeter about the entrepreneur combined with the market, and Chandler the visible hand of the manager. And in some sense, these are not quite competing visions, but in some say they did compete. Actually, we had some different experiments running in the 20th century around approaches to innovation. And if you think about what happened in the latter part of the 20th century, it would seem to me that, in some sense, the Schumpeterian vision seemed to have prevailed. That is, when we think about, folks, the kind of policies we wanted a lot of entrepreneurship. We wanted the entrepreneurs to come in and drive out and destroy those behemoths. And by and large, a lot of that did happen. We think about the once great companies who were driven out by the entrepreneurs, the IBMs who were knocked down to size by the Microsofts and the Intels of the world, and the AT&Ts that disappeared and were replaced by mobile phone carriers, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we've gotten very comfortable with that idea that a kind of Schumpeterian creative destruction model is the way forward, is the playbook. So let's sort of think about where we are in the 21st century. And if that's your view, then you might get a little worried when you start to think about some of the data that we're seeing on growing concentration and declining rates of new entry of firms. So first, let's think about what is it? Is the Smith model at all relevant in the 21st century? And in some sense, it really is, and in a way that I hadn't thought about until quite recently, which if we think about some of the companies that have really come to dominate the early stages of the 21st century economy, Amazon, Google, Facebook, and then we think of a host of other players like Airbnb, Uber, Expedia. What are they? They're market creators. They created market. They didn't create like a new market for a product. They literally operate markets. They are creating this invisible hand, and that's why they've grown. But they're fascinating in another way. They're really, I think, important institutional innovation, because yesterday, I think in this seat, Franco Malerbo was talking about markets, but markets are embedded in a set of other institutions, and generally public institutions, which help markets function. Here what we have is a set of private, almost completely private institutions running the markets. They set up their own rules. And in fact, Facebook wants to introduce its own currency. I think they're calling it the Libra or something. But you don't even need that to have a currency. This morning I was trying to pay a colleague back for something. I didn't have American cash on me. Is Connie Helfat here? It was Connie. I needed to give Connie some cash. And she said, no, just email me an Amazon gift certificate for the amount, because she'll use it up. So, I mean, that's an Amazon gift certificate, becomes current. So we have these, and this gets really interesting in terms of the size of these. Now, here's what gets maybe interesting, troubling to some, because we've also heard about trying to break these things up. Somebody in a session yesterday talked about we need to maybe break up some of these behemoths, and in Europe there's active discussion about that. It would almost strike me as a somewhat, you're trying to destroy, in some sense, these market creators. If you like markets, you should actually like these institutions. On the other hand, and this is the really maybe the more challenging or troubling part, the very size and scale of these and the increasing returns to scale benefits they have are actually making it much harder for the Schumpeterian creative destruction to occur. Okay, so it's it's very hard to get into those businesses today that those companies dominate, and they dominate the whole ecosystem. They don't just dominate their one piece of it. So if we really believed in the Schumpeterian vision, and I'll draw a distinction between Schumpeter, Jay talked about Schumpeter's vision. You really talked about Schumpeter, what's sometimes called Schumpeter Mark I, which is the idea of big firms dominating, versus Schumpeter II, which is really about creative destruction. I'm talking about creative destruction. What do we do about it? So there I want to come back to Chandler. We haven't talked at all about Chandler over the last couple of days. But the view, I think we've written off too quickly the idea, it's almost become accepted that large companies are dinosaurs and they can't innovate, etc. That is by and large on average true. There's certainly some big exceptions, but if you think about it, there is no particular reason why scale should impede innovation. And for certain kinds of innovation, it may require a massive amount of scale to do it. In fact, if you have to reorchestrate ecosystems, it takes scale. And if we talk about time horizon, we talk about big companies and they're short-sighted because of public equity markets. If you've ever been involved with a startup, and I have been involved throughout my career in many, when you have 2 months of cash left, you're pretty darn short-sighted. So I think we overwrite the idea that big companies actually have the capital to do some of these, but they haven't been very capable of doing it, and I think that needs to change. In my view, and I'm just going to wrap up on this comment. So first, my view is yes, big companies can't innovate. It's not because of their scale per se. It's because of how they're designed, managed, and run. But what that says is that we need to, if we want to think about the 21st century playbook, and if scale starts to become a kind of inherent feature of it, then we really need to think about remaking the modern corporation in ways that it can be more innovative, that is, larger scale companies. But if we can't make over those companies until we actually make over the managers. The idea, the kind of Chandlerian manager of the 20th century, or even the late 19th century, was a coordinator. They really were a manager. They weren't an innovator. They weren't an entrepreneur. And we sort of associate the idea of being an entrepreneur with being part of a startup, but that doesn't necessarily have to be true. So I think it's important that, and for those of us like myself who teach in a business school, and we're sitting here on the University of Edinburgh Business School campus, I think it's a really important part of what we need to think about, which is how do we create the modern manager of the 21st century who can be an innovator in this realm. Thanks.
I appreciate the invitation to come to this conference, and I particularly appreciate the invitation to think about what I have thought about over the last 30 years through the lens of Adam Smith, and that's been a focus on sort of economic organization and entrepreneurship. And I guess I want to sort of frame my remarks around the following setup. Let's imagine that Adam Smith was to rise from his tomb, which is about 100 yards from here, just the other side of this little church, and engage with our literature for several weeks, and then be invited to offer his thoughts and comments. And I believe that he would issue two strong critiques along what I would characterize as two dimensions, in which he sort of would see us as intellectually misguided. And I think the first critique is that he would look with aghast, I think, at the rather simple model of man that underlies our theories of organization, a model which is, I think, largely focused on self-interest, or what he described as self-love. Of course, Smith wouldn't dismiss entirely the importance of self-interest, but his model of man was much more complex, and in many ways runs counter to the current trajectory of the expansion of a model of man which is prevalent in economics, which is to sort of highlight his stupidity or irrationality and biases. But for Smith, economic actors were marked by their reason and speech, and distinguished by the diversity of their sentiments, their productively divergent viewpoints, beliefs, opinions about all kinds of things, including how to compose value and how to govern. For Smith, every actor had what he called its own unique principle of motion, not defined by simple self-interest, but rather by a diverse set of beliefs about how to pursue this self-interest. For Smith, the path of progress toward wealth was more than the free market exchange. It involved creative production of at least two distinct forms. And admittedly, I don't think he was very clear about this model of innovation or entrepreneurship, but there are some I think, remarkable seeds in what he expressed. So one was clearly a classic learning by doing or learning by using, with greater specialization fueling a focus that sort of accelerates this learning by doing. But Smith, I think, also highlights another source of creative production generated by, in his mind, a distinctly different set of economic actors. These individuals were not the users of the machines of production, but were what he called philosophers, or individuals whose trade, at least in his words, whose trade it is not to do anything, but to observe everything, and who upon that account are often capable of combining together the powers of the most distant and dissimilar objects in the progress of society. In other words, these were entrepreneurs, these were deep thinkers who imagine and cognitively create clever and valuable recombinations. Therefore, by implication for Smith, promoting substantive entrepreneurship and wealth production is more than fueling greater action or promoting more learning by doing, or even just experimentation prompted by specialization and incentives. For Smith, promoting entrepreneurship would also involve, by implication, fueling these great philosophers who, through their own unique beliefs and theories, see what others cannot see. Therefore, for Smith, and I think the political theorists of the day, the challenge of economic organization is well captured by Emma Rothschild's commentary on Smith, where she says it was how to describe a universe or a society in which everybody has opinions and theories and conflicting, changing desires. It's to make a system out of the innumerable swerving molecula of individual reflections and sentiments. It was to create, in her words, a theory of people with theories, one that harnessed those divergent but valuable sentiments into a wealth-producing system. Smith also seemed to offer us a warning of the consequences of adopting a more simplistic model of man like the one that I think undergirds our current theories. He talks about the folly of an architect who, in trying to govern these complex economic actors, wrongly imagines that he can arrange the different members with as much ease as the hand arranges the different pieces upon a chessboard. This was the quote that Neil Ferguson talked about, and then wrongly assumes that these pieces have no other principle of motion besides that which the hand impresses upon them. Instead, he suggests that every single piece has a principle of motion of its own, altogether different from that which the legislator, or we could think about this as the organizational architect, might choose to impress upon it. If these two principles, that is the principle of the architect and the principles that are guiding the chess pieces, coincide and act in the same direction, the game of human society will go on easily and harmoniously and is very likely to be happy and successful. If they're opposite or different, the game will go on miserably, and society must be at all times in the highest degree of disorder. I think Smith would look at our current state and say, I told you so. Of course, Smith was envisioning architects of central governments, but surely the same critique applies to those architecting organizations. If organizational architects obsess only with correcting self-interest and thereby only solve the moral hazard problem, then the organizations they compose will indeed go on miserably and remain in the highest degree of disorder. Smith's challenge, I think, to us is to compose a theory of organization that recognizes and harnesses these valuable and divergent beliefs and sentiments, and in particular fuels, funds, and grants voice to those with particularly valuable sentiments. The challenge is more than channeling self-interest. It's about unlocking hidden value in these divergent beliefs, sentiments, and theories. So I think that's sort of his first critique. I think his second critique would be to take issue with what we've built to be a very highly reductionist conception of economic organization. For Smith, economic organization was about composing a society, a well-governed one in particular, one with the capacity to produce wealth, and one that prompts what he described as the cooperation and assistance of great multitudes. While Smith illuminated the role of self-interest, he was equally focused on more collective constructs like justice and architecting concepts like justice and some semblance of equality, or at least what he described, or what we might think about as, or what he described as sympathy, we might think about as empathy. However, beginning with Coase, the study of economic organization assumed a highly reductionist path, as we're very familiar with, to architecting this cooperation. Firms emerged from sequenced decisions by an entrepreneur about how to organize dyadic exchanges, becoming, in Coase's words, larger as additional transactions are organized by the entrepreneur, becoming smaller as the entrepreneur abandons organization of some transactions. Or in related literature, that firms are simply a nexus of contracts or a sub-economy, essentially the aggregation of exchanges or transactions that the entrepreneur manages through formal authority or externally through markets. The contrast of this conception from Smith's societal level notion, I think, is rather stark, and I suspect Smith would push us to build a theory of economic organization that's more societal and more social in its focus, where the entrepreneur's task involves composing a well-governed society with a shared purpose defined by the entrepreneur's vision and a deep sense of justice that supports the consummate cooperation that's really required for generating wealth. Now, of course, one might claim that economists are very late to this game, that sociologists and organizational theorists have been at this task for a very long time, describing the fundamentally social nature of economic exchange and organization. And of course, this is partly true, but in disregarding ownership, firm boundaries, formal incentives of any kind, their work has very little to do with the theory of the firm. Yes, sociology matters and trust reigns supreme, but what specifically does this say about how to incorporate, when to make, when to buy, how to structure formal incentives? Smith actually offers his own, I think, interesting critique of this kind of simplistic conception of sociality that pervades some of these more social theories of the firm. And admittedly, now I'm going to cherry pick from Smith. He talks in one passage about the fact that dogs will fawn over their masters to develop their goodwill. And then he draws the parallel to humans, that we will do the same. And then he remarks that in a civilized society, humans stand at all times in need of cooperation and assistance of great multitudes, and while his whole life is scarce sufficient to gain the friendship of a few persons. In other words, we just don't have time to organize through friendship. That mechanism alone, we don't have enough time to build those friendships. Echoing Smith's potential critique, I see our challenges composing then a social theory of the firm, where firms are sub-societies, not sub-economies, where boundaries and formal control profoundly matter because they offer legally distinct forms of control that the entrepreneur can productively use to shape this society, to shape a sense of purpose and to shape a sense of justice, and that there really are legal virtues and mechanisms that are offered inside the firm that are not available outside the firm to shape these societal level or sub-societal level conceptions. At the same time, within the firm, because you have this enhanced power to shape purpose and justice, you also have enhanced responsibility in the sense that you can completely mess things up and destroy that sub-society very, very easily. Within firm boundaries, entrepreneurs have, as defined by legal scholars, an enhanced capacity to shape the way work is done. However, with its greater power, as I said, comes greater responsibility. In summary, I believe Smith would invite us to think very differently about how to compose organizations that inspire the cooperation of multitudes. He'd push us to recognize and make productive use of a broad array of economic sentiments, and he would push us to think much more deeply about our role in composing sub-societies that are imbued with a sense of fairness and shared purpose, and that really is the great power that comes from the boundary of the firm. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot to all of the panelists for raising a number of really important and interesting issues. Let me try to draw out a few common themes that I heard from the presentations and try to kick off some discussion among the panelists and among all of us in the room. So one common theme has to do with how we think about human behavior. What is our sort of model of man, as Adam Smith would put it? How do we understand people's beliefs, how people learn, whether we're talking specifically about entrepreneurs or about other agents in society? Is there a trade-off between sort of the liberty that people in the crypto community tend to prioritize and the sort of broader sets of social obligations, for example, that Todd mentioned? Another theme that we heard was this distinction between large formal institutions and smaller, more diffuse networks. We have centralized decision-making versus more decentralized modes of organization, public ordering versus private ordering. As Neil Ferguson pointed out in his talk this morning, and I think he was right, the economy-wide argument about top-down central planning, central allocation of resources by enlightened bureaucrats and officials versus a more bottom-up market type of system is over, right? What people today mean by socialism is not state ownership of the means of production and direction of economic activity, but redistribution or people being nice to each other or whatever. But there is a discussion within a market context of this sort of trade-off between top-down and bottom-up. So I think Jay in his remarks, for example, with the example of the ICE hotel, I think gave us sort of what's frequently asserted in the entrepreneurship and innovation literature, that the large established entities, either through lack of incentive or through stagnation and so forth, they're unable to imagine and create these unique opportunities, as Jay describes them, for really innovative products and services. But on the other hand, right, from Gary, we have the notion that, well, large enterprises, building on, Schumpeter Mark I and II,
Mark I, that's right.
actually may be more innovative or have abilities to innovate that have not been fully recognized. And Benito, of course, is challenging the notion that all sort of social and legal institutions can be provided from smaller entities and from decentralized bottom-up kinds of modes of interaction. So there's a little bit of a tension there. Let me start by asking Todd, since you didn't touch exactly on that point, what do you think? In other words, your idea of entrepreneurs being kind of leaders in helping to establish a moral and just order as well as an efficient one, is this something that you see as just happening inside the firm? So the entrepreneur within his or her organization models certain kinds of behaviors and encourages among employees? Or is this a system-wide, economy-wide, market-level, bottom-up kind of process?
So obviously it could be either, right? I guess the way I'm thinking about this, there's a legal distinction between the control that you have inside the firm and what you have outside the firm, and you're able to sort of shape the way work is done. There are expectations about loyalty and friendship relations that exist in sort of the law that supports, at least in the United States, relationships inside the firm and outside the firm. And so one of the central questions any entrepreneur faces is, what do I do inside the firm? What do I do outside the firm? And there is, as a consequence of employment law, a set of leverage that one has to build and shape fairness, to build and shape a sense of vision and purpose that one does not have if one is using simply market kinds of exchanges. And that there really is a difference between a nexus of contracts conception of the firm and a conception of the firm where one takes seriously these legal differences that exist.
Okay, and so Benito, you say that some of these moral rules and practices cannot or tend not to emerge bottom up, that we need more formal institutions like the church or like states, nation states, other institutions to kind of help to shape those sorts of beliefs. I mean, look, nobody wants to go back to the Encyclopedia Britannica over Wikipedia, right? So why would it be different with kind of rules and rules of justice and so forth?
Well, it's not, I think, a question of going back at all, but it's a question of learning from history about the future. No? And I was just trying to learn from, take the opportunity, which was very fruitful for me at least, to observe and apply to observe some of the tensions, and forgive me because what I have presented were totally, well, not totally, but mostly conjectures about big forces in play. No? Let's mention two. One I think is very clear, no? That we libertarians have forgotten the foundations of the liberal state, which are rooted in government intervention. I mean, we have been, in a sense, I feel, distracted by the welfare state. We focus too much on the welfare state, and then we forget about the rule of law. I was happy to hear today the emphasis on the rule of law. I mean, the functionings of the police, the judges, and this is very visible in blockchain, because these promoters of blockchain were forgetting the basic role of these institutions. No? About morality is a much harder case, a much more, but maybe I am influenced because I have been twice in last month in Sweden, and being, well, it's a, I don't know if I have serious doubts that the moral basis in the theory of moral sentiments is adapted to the demands of the citizens of wealthy capitalist societies. But I don't have an answer. I mean, I don't want to go back to the Catholic Church of the 15th century. I mean, it's not that the argument at all.
Probably not going to happen anyway.
Yeah. Well, so we'll open up just one second, but let me raise another issue, especially for Gary, in your concept of sort of creative construction as opposed to destruction. You know, it's common to observe that that established entities are being, well, there's some substitution, right, for contract enforcement and so forth by non-traditional entities, but we see many large firms being disrupted by smaller counterparts, and a lot of traditional institutions, often state-provided institutions, we see new substitutes emerging. So public transportation is beginning to be in some countries and may eventually be further challenged by the emergence of ride-sharing systems and self-driving cars and other modes of technology. One of the big institutions that many of us in the room know quite well is higher education. Gary, do you think that the incumbent universities will be able to embrace or even create new technologies that will allow them to maintain their dominant position, or will they be the IBMs or of tomorrow?
No, universities in general are so badly run. They don't have to worry about disruption. They have to worry about gagging on their own saliva and dying. That's the problem. Seriously, they're just completely inefficient. They need to deal with their first order effects and then deal with the future problems. So yeah, sure. I mean, higher education could be disrupted. Anything can be. We don't know. We can't predict the future well at all. Every time if you go back, and one thing I do in my book is I look at a whole bunch of predictions people make about all sorts of things and how badly wrong they are. I mean, so in 1910, Thomas Edison was absolutely convinced that the electric car was going to dominate. In fact, there were far more electric cars on the road in 1910 than there were, but they couldn't anticipate the discovery of oil reserves in the U.S. And so I think this is kind of fool's gold to try to guess. I think if you're a university, you should be trying to, first of all, do get your house in order, get some efficient processes. Bureaucratic organizations never adapt. They often don't even survive normal competition, and that's the problem that universities have today. I don't think
having cartel power helps too.
Yeah. So I think that's the issue. But I do want to I do want to open it up to the groups. I want to hear the questions and reactions and discuss. But I do think we forget that when it comes to scale, I mean, people always talk about Apple. Well, when Apple introduced the iPhone, it was a $24 billion company. Okay, it was number 123 on the Fortune 500. When Amazon introduced web services in 2006, which was fundamental, and they were a $40 billion company, and Honda introduced the Honda. These are all anecdotal, but they're kind of proofs of feasibility that large companies do. When Amazon or Google today, it's got a market cap of close to $1 trillion. It is one of the largest companies on the face of the earth. They're doing all sorts of stuff. So I think we just have to get out of that old mode. That it just becomes such a dull story. Big companies are dinosaurs. They're going to go. It's just a dull story.
Yeah,
I was going to clarify your comment about what I said in response to this too. I'm actually indifferent as to. I think it's empirically the case that on average, large firms are less innovative than small firms, but it doesn't follow from that observation that there are no large firms who can engage in creation processes. So I'm really indifferent to that question.
Yeah. Thank you for the clarification. Let's get some questions, and if I could echo what Neil Ferguson said this morning, I'll remind you, a question is one, at most 2 sentences followed by a question mark. It is not 10 or 15 or 20 statements. Please.
I'll do my best, but I'm hoping I can shape the discussion a little bit. So,
sorry, we have a microphone. Please use the mic.
So, since 1989, I've been a serial and parallel tech entrepreneur. So I look at it, and I'm very heavily involved in AI now. But I think that what Gary was talking about with these kind of ecosystem new markets, for example, I'll choose to pick on Amazon, where I can sell my products on Amazon. But I would argue that in this case, there's an invisible thumb on the scale, which is Amazon's. So if I'm selling my product on Amazon and I'm doing quite well, Amazon now comes up with their own Amazon Basics version of my product.
Okay, yes.
So I'd love to hear, because this is so I'm an entrepreneur and I start competing. Well, this ecosystem exists with AWS, where Amazon created Amazon Prime Video.
So this,
same story.
Thank you. This question was raised in the panel this morning as well. Are we in a situation now where large incumbents are thwarting innovation rather than promoting it? Actually, sorry, let's do the thing that we did this morning. Let's take a few questions and then ask panelists to respond. Michael?
Well, let me continue on the previous question. And I wonder whether it might not be worth updating Schumpeter a little bit. Because we've been speaking about Mark 1
Schumpeter
versus...
1 or 2, yes.
No, I'm thinking that it's beyond 1 or 2. The benefit of Schumpeter, benefit of Chapter, is that they looked at the way organizations worked. So for those of us who actually study ecosystems, what we see is that the firms, 7 out of the big 10 biggest firms, which are firms that drive platforms and ecosystems, use other people's energy and innovation. So they create a context whereby the complementers innovate. Now this is different from both Mark 1 and Mark 2, and we're speaking about a different way of coordinating and organizing innovation and entrepreneurship. Bounded within orchestrator power, raises issues of power which are different, and raises issues of organization that are different, and also the Smithian questions that are different. And I wonder how our panel conceives of that, both updating our theory and updating our prescriptions for that.
Okay. Anyone have a question that's closely related to these two before we move on to a new topic, please?
Yes. Every market competes with it. Being an entrepreneur myself, and having some experience also with selling things on Amazon, my question actually to Gary is, for me in a market was always an opportunity not only to sell on traffic, but also to learn about my customers. With Amazon, basically the only one who really learns there is Amazon, because I don't even get customer data. I cannot communicate directly with them. So does it really fulfill the function of a market which propelled us forward? And doesn't it basically, all the learning is to Amazon?
Yeah. Thank you. One more question on this topic, and then we'll get some responses from the panel.
Entrepreneur, I have a different and simpler question. Sorry, use the mic. So I'm an entrepreneur, and I have a different, simpler question, and that's about access to capital. And in particular, my question is there a feeling that uncertainty is going to be created by a lack of access to capital based on higher taxes? And that's something that's kind of near and dear to my heart with respect to the future of capitalism.
Okay, just behind you also, please.
I just want to say I've really enjoyed the discussion, but I thought when Benito said conjecture, that there's an awful lot of untested ideas, and many of them get good support from anecdotes, but I'm not hearing anything robust and reliable. Where's, just because David Teese is encouraging us for a manifesto, where's some of the evidence-based decision-making in this?
Well, or to put another way, is it true that current market structures are, can they be improved upon, and if so, how? What's the tangible action that comes out of that? Is it antitrust? Is it a different way of enforcing a different kind of regulation? Gary, go first, but others can jump in.
Just for the last point, I mean, this is a different kind of conference where, you know, if we want to start laying out data on concentration, et cetera, I could refer you to lots of stuff. We can do it, so I'm happy to engage you in that separately, but I don't think this is the place for this. I mean, I think the questions on I love the invisible thumb. I think you're absolutely right. This to me is the dilemma, and I think to Michael's point, tying these together, I mean, this is what I think is so fascinating about it. We have a major institutional innovation that occurred with particularly Amazon, Google. I mean, Google is as well as a huge marketplace, and the others. I mean, there's lots of these others. They're smaller, but I mean, it's a really important institutional innovation. That we're still just trying to understand. We're getting to understand. So I do think we need to update our theory around it, but it does raise the troubling issue. I would agree. I think you do get the distortion. These are not markets that work as dispassionate markets. And there have been private markets before. You think about stock exchanges are private market. I mean, they're companies. I mean, New York Stock Exchange is a company. So is Walmart. Right, and and so they work in a dispassionate way to allow the player. These don't. These get involved, and that raises the so to the extent I think you want to think about a policy response, it could actually be that if you're in a market business, then there has to be some protection for the players on there. But I don't think it will address the learning. That may not be one that you can do. I mean, it depends what the policies are. But they have created massive opportunity to innovate. That's what I think is exciting. I mean, and they're going back to Hank Chesper's work on open innovation. These things start to open up an innovation process as well. So that's what makes it so interesting. There's a sharp trade-off here in terms of creates massive opportunity, but creates distortions.
Jay?
Yeah, it's essentially building on those observations. I remember, say, 25, 30 years ago, we would be in this room, we were talking about the monopoly power of Walmart. They have a thumb on the scale. It's like, and then Amazon comes through. So there's always two classes of remedies to these problems. One class of remedies is antitrust. I'm reluctant to move too quickly, frankly, on antitrust in these contexts, because the other one is innovation itself. So I hear people who sell through Amazon are angry about not having access to information about customers. I smell opportunity, okay? And so could we imagine an alternative mechanism? And I know the scale issues. I don't want to talk about the detail of that entry issue, but the point is, every time we're convinced that we need to engage in antitrust activity, is often the case that innovation and entrepreneurship will take care of those problems themselves.
Yeah. Todd, did you want to add to that?
I was just going to say, I'm always in the camp of, things are more similar than different today, but, wasn't Adam Smith watching these large trading companies of the day that were dominating Britain, and aren't they almost exactly what Amazon is today, but not enabled in the same way by digital technology? Come on, these are marketplaces that were privately controlled.
Returns.
And So what is unique?
I smell a good paper.
What is unique is that information technology has transformed things, and there was a lot of talk 30 years ago about information technology was going to democratize innovation, and I think the piece that we missed, as did IBM and many others, right, was that it was also going to create these enormous network externalities, and so that has enabled the formation and sort of fueled the formation of these large monopolistic type, trending toward monopoly marketplaces. But we are familiar with these large dominant marketplaces. We've seen these in the past, just to be clear.
And the governments are already responding.
Privately owned.
So.
Yeah, I personally think Todd is right that things are much more similar. Things are not as different today as we think they are. I also think Jay is right that feasible interventions are limited. I like some of you, I always have my students read this great article by Victor Keegan, I think from 1998, titled, "Will MySpace Ever Lose Its Monopoly?" And technology and markets have a way of innovating around what appear to us today to be sort of dominant market positions. I don't think Amazon is like Edinburgh Castle at the top of a rock. A couple more questions on new topics. This gentleman here and then here. Please. Who's got the microphone? Oh.
Thank you. It's a fascinating panel. I am going to go a little bit over your one sentence limit. I apologize. I am not an academic. I'm actually an entrepreneur or wannabe entrepreneur, a recovering entrepreneur for the last 25, 30 years in large companies like Philips, Endowed, Chemical. I started my own company in the energy space. It's fascinating to hear you. Todd, I think you sort of touched on it. If we look at Adam Smith and he was looking down today, the whole idea of the social mission-driven work and impact. I'm wondering if you take what the panel this morning was talking about, what do we do? Or somebody said, what the hell do we do? And I'm looking at Donald Trump and this whole aspect of, he is an entrepreneur. If in the books of Buckingham was said, let's break all the rules. So he's breaking all the rules, and there is no rule of law for him. It's his rule of law, which I'm not sure I agree with that. However, I'm wondering if this whole social entrepreneurship, which is what I started a social entrepreneurship company last year called Carbon, largely to focus on education and women's empowerment, and the force we're seeing worldwide, to gather to this, I think it's sort of pushing us more towards this social impact.
Yeah. So your question is what?
Well, I think we should frame the conversation.
Okay. Suggestion to think more on social. Okay.
Taking this towards the question this morning, saying what should we do? There's a role that I think business can play.
Okay, thank you.
In social entrepreneurship, and not just saying entrepreneurship and agent.
Okay. This gentleman next to you, please.
Steve Benning from Forbes. I've heard a lot about the problems and the questions. I'm not hearing much about the solutions that we're going to put in this manifesto, so I'd really like to hear. You suggested that some big companies can innovate. Why did they innovate when others didn't? Why did Microsoft become the biggest company on the planet and GE is being sold for scrap? What is the difference between these?
In the front row, please.
So first of all, just
wait, microphone, please.
To give justice to good old Joseph. Joseph said when talking about Schumpeter, Marquardt, and Schumpeter that this belongs to different contexts or sectors. In some sectors or contexts, you have Schumpeter, Marquardt. In other sectors, you have Schumpeter, Marquardt. In some sectors, you have creative distractions. In others, you have creative accumulation. So in a sense, they coexist. But I want to ask a question to the Pisano-Zenger view of Adam Smith, and which is fascinating what you said. I'm combining your two presentations. Do you think that there is a coexistence of small companies and big companies at different level of aggregation? In a sense that at the smaller level, Gary talks about specialization and entry, and very high entrepreneurship. At the higher level, you have coordination and integration, and then you have the big company. And the two have to coexist. Is it the Pisano-Zenger view of Adam Smith in the 21st century or not?
Okay, we'll come back to Pisano-Zenger just a minute. I want to let Dick Nelson jump the queue here. Sorry, folks in the back.
want to make an observation, and my question is, what do you think about the implications of it? The observation is, first of all, that virtually all of the research that has been done on innovation has been oriented to innovation in manufacturing. There are a few exceptions, but not that many. That's also not surprising in that most of the driving innovation that's affected economic and social change has been in manufacturing. My observation is that looking at the present as compared with years ago and looking into the future, manufacturing now is a quite small fraction of our current economy. Agriculture is a smaller and smaller one. There's some on mining. Physical production is a declining fraction of GNP. Things like medical care, education, and care for the aged, and taking care of youngsters while both of their parents are at work are becoming a larger and larger fraction of what is going on in the economy. The question is, what do these kinds of changes in the nature of what our economies are affect the kind of studies of innovation that should go on? If what is needed here, normatively, is a major change over time, picking up on some question that was made earlier, is there a call for a major change in the orientation and distribution of the kind of innovative work that is going on in the economy?
Okay, thank you. What I'd like to do in our remaining 5 minutes is hold off for just a second on the question about solutions, but quickly ask any of the panelists if they want to comment on sort of the move from manufacturing to services and the role of sort of entrepreneurship in promoting broader societal goals.
I'll take the first on it. To Dick's point, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, the really interesting innovations that are now occur not just are in services, but they're actually organizational and institutional innovations. In fact, going back to the conversation we were having before, these organizations created a massively new institutional arrangement of a kind of a large private, highly automated market. And they've had a huge impact. So I think we need, as researchers, to spend more time understanding that, understanding what the principles are, and particularly very little
organizational innovation.
Zero.
Physical innovation.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Sure. Todd?
So, combining to this question of what to do, I think one of the things we need to do is to change the way we teach about what sort of leadership is, what management is, that it's much less about manipulating this single sentiment, which is self-interest, and that there is a much broader array of sort of levers at this architect's disposal, and that those ought to be used to craft different types of organizations. That is a form of organizational innovation, right? Recognizing that the levers that are in the management's control are not just about manipulating self-interest and manipulating self-interest through incentives.
Benito.
Well, just to point out that it's difficult to innovate in services. I mean, and this is something that I think in these days was not mentioned, but developed economies with a huge share of economic activity in services, if there is an human element, it's much more difficult. And we move into what? Into self-service, but this is to some extent inefficient, even at the moral level.
This means that if you continue to have the kind of innovation that we're having, and you have difficulty in services, and I think the
I'm not sure I
don't think I agree with that. I think we've seen massive amount of innovation.
My apps, look at all those services.
Retail has been completely restructured. That's the service sector, healthcare. I mean, there's a massive amount going on there. So
we're not agreeing with your assertion.
Yeah, I think we're. But we don't understand.
We don't understand international services. Let's let it. Let's leave
Did you just lose control?
I think I did. Yeah, losing control of my classroom here.
Personal services.
But I do want to, guys, gentlemen, let's not lose sight of the fact that a lot of the service innovations, like in many sense, information aggregators, market makers, sharing apps, these are organizational innovations as much as they are technological innovations, and I think Dick is exactly right on that point. Jay?
So I would like to comment on the sort of social responsibility aspect of it. CSR, I actually call it silly CSR. As you know, these corporate goals, we're going to do the following 6 or 7 things and check a few boxes. But you're asking about a much more fundamental question, which is, a deep purpose in an organization. The thing that is wonderful about our economy and about innovation and entrepreneurship is as entrepreneurs and as leaders in larger firms, our task is to gather individuals and resources that they bring together to co-specialize so that we can create value together. And there's all sorts of reasons to come together, one of which, and Todd got this exactly right, one of which is because we can make a lot of money, but also a common sense of purpose, a sense of identity, a sense of social cohesion. Those are also very important. And so in that sense, I actually, even though have the chair of social entrepreneurship, I actually don't think social entrepreneurship is really different.
Are you going to return the check?
Not yet. Every entrepreneurial or innovative activity I've seen, even innovative activities in large companies, the people who are involved in that process, there is a sense of identity and purpose that goes beyond simply a paycheck. It goes into a sense of purpose and connection and community. Large firms, small firms. And so broadening our objective function is really important in understanding that. And I would echo that importance.
Thank you, Jay. So I want to apologize to those of you who did not get a chance to ask your question because we're out of time, but I'm sure our panelists would be happy to chat with you during lunch as we walk back to the lunch place. So please join me in thanking our panelists for their insights and for their time.